These would be federal programs and federal grants. The tuition that students pay as a part of their expense is also included in this. So there's about $2 billion of these federal and others. By far the largest chunk of federal money that comes into the state ends up in health and welfare. In addition to the $3.5 billion of state money that we spend on health and welfare.
It's all getting bigger every time that you do this.
The state receives, in addition to our $3.5 billion, the state receives about $6.5 billion a year. And that's before the federal health care legislation that passed a few weeks ago. In most states, this federal money is called Medicaid. It's the federal health care program for families under the federal poverty limit. Can I get some water? And in most states, it's a separate run program. But in Arizona, we have a special waiver agreement, and we mix it together with the state money, the access money, and we run it as one big program under access. But the federal and the state money combined for health and welfare adds up to about $10 billion a year. Then there's a few other little stragglers. There's about $500 million a year that goes through the state lottery system. That's their total ticket sales. By the time they pay the winning tickets and the expenses of running the agency, there's about $70 or $80 million a year that goes to run state parks and wildlife and the arts and some education stuff.
That's all they make off the lottery?
Yeah.
Wow.
Only about $70 or $80 million.
What do they take in, do you know?
They take in $500 million a year, but they're only making a net profit. They only have an excess of about 7 or 8%.
Wow.
That ends up in the programs that the lottery was designed to fund. There's also about $500 million a year that goes through what's called the workers' compensation. That's the state comp fund, where employers pay into an insurance fund in case their employees get injured on the job. It's about $500 million there. There's about $500 million a year of environmental money that comes in from the feds mostly. EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, that goes for a variety of programs once it gets in the state. And there's about $500 million in the Department of Administration, which is mostly state employee health care and retirement benefits and that. And then there's hundreds of other little ones that also adds up to about $500 million. So the total of state spending each year is not just the $10.5 billion in the general fund, the yellow. It's about $32 billion total. But you can see where the big three are. K-12 education at almost $11 billion, health and welfare at $10 billion, higher education at $5 billion. Everything else is about 6 or 7 total combined. So those are by far the big three. Now the one that is short and really having problems is the general fund, the yellow one, the $10.5 billion. And let's talk a little bit about how that got so bad. The state uses a fiscal year to keep track of our money. We don't start counting on January 1st, end in December. We start on July the 1st, end the next June. So we're coming up on the last part of the 2010 budget. But in order to understand, and I think the video is going to capture 2010. We'll have to
switch.
We got to go back 2 or 3 years to figure out how it got so out of balance, because just a couple of years ago, things were in pretty good shape as of about 2007. When you're building the state budget, the 2 most important numbers you look at are what's the tax collection, the tax revenue that's coming in every year, and what are your ongoing expenses that are going out every year. If you've got a 2nd grader in the school system this year, you're probably going to have a 3rd grader next year, as opposed to something that you build one time for a building or something like that. So your ongoing revenue coming in and your ongoing expenses that are going out, very important to watch and keep those balanced. State also has a rainy day fund, which is our savings account, and in years where we're not spending every dollar that comes in, we try to set aside some money in the rainy day fund as a reserve. On top of the rainy day fund, we also keep track of the ending cash balance, because we never know exactly how much revenue is going to come in. We have to set the budget at a certain dollar amount, no more. And so if we haven't deposited any extra that comes in into the rainy day, it just ends up in the ending cash balance. In 2007, the revenue coming into the general fund was projected to be about $9.8 billion. We had 10.5 over here on the table. But we're going to go back a couple of years and pick up from where things kind of started to get out of balance. The revenue expected that year was 9.8. We didn't want to, well, some did, but we didn't want to spend every dollar that came in, so we set the spending at 9.6. Because 05 and 06 had been very good years, and we'd actually collected more than we had expected, we had already deposited about $700 million in the rainy day fund. Had almost $750 million in the rainy day fund. And on top of that $700 million, we had $350 million of ending cash left over from 06. So we had over $1 billion of reserves. In fact, if we had $350 of cash and collected 9.8 and only spent 9.6, it would grow by 200. Everybody was kind of hoping that the cash balance would grow to $550 million. Now, with all due respect to Governor Napolitano and her budget approach, one of the biggest disagreements we had, this was the last year I was president of the Senate and working on these budgets, her budget office always said, all of this ending cash balance can be added to the revenue we think we're going to collect next year, and that combined amount can be spent on ongoing permanent programs. And many of us said, no, that's accumulated over a couple of years because we didn't spend every dollar that was coming in. But once you spend it, it's gone. It's not coming in every year like your tax collections. So you've got to be very careful spending that accumulated cash that's accumulated over a couple of years. It's kind of like a family that's living off of $50,000 of income. If Aunt Sarah dies and leaves them a $10,000 inheritance, if they increase their spending to $60,000 a year, they can do that for 1 year. And then the 10's gone and they're making 50, spending 60, and you can have a problem. Well, in 2008, the budget gurus, or whoever you want to call them, the legislature has a budget office and the governor has a budget office, and they get the bankers and the economists and they all get together and they try to project what the revenue is going to be. They said, we think the revenue in 08 is going to go to $10.1 billion. And unfortunately, I think they saw we're going to have $500 million here. They set the spending at $10.6 billion. That's about the 10.5 we just showed you over here in the yellow boxes. But when they were building the 08 budget, which would have been in the spring of 07, 08 budget would have started in July of 07, the economy was starting to slow down. And the revenue department called over and said, we're not quite going to get to the $9.8 billion that we were expecting in 07. We're going to get to 9.6. And then when July and August and September, the first quarter of the new budget numbers started coming in, they realized that the economy was not just slowing, it was contracting. And they weren't on a pace to get to $10.1 billion in 08. They were on a pace to shrink to 9.1. So they were going to be $200 million short of projections here, $1 billion short here. They had a $1.2 billion problem between these two budget years. And how was it solved? Well, $500 million was transferred out of the rainy day fund into the general fund and called revenue for that current year, so that it could all be spent that year. Then they did $300 million of what are called fund sweeps. These little other funds that I mentioned over here, the state collects money on certain activities or industries throughout the state, but it's supposed to save the money up and use it on those things. For example, somebody figured out years ago that not all of the gasoline sold in the state of Arizona goes in cars and trucks that are driving on the road. Some small percentage goes into boats that are driving on our lakes. So every year we carve out a small portion of the gasoline tax, and instead of putting it in the highway maintenance fund, we put it in the state lake improvement fund. But you're supposed to save the money up and use it on the lakes. Well, if the governor and the legislature get in a pickle, they can go into the